Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me as I close out 2024 with my annual unscripted Q&A session. Over the last couple of weeks, you guys have been sending me questions and prompts for things you'd like to hear me talk about in this unscripted format, and so today I'm going to be answering the ones that I received, while in the background I have either something topical related to whatever the question is, or I have maybe some B-roll from video footage that I didn't use this year. I had to clear out a fair bit recently because of a full playthrough on a project that I'm working on for the next couple of months. It promises to be a rather interesting one in several ways. I'm not going to spoil anything yet. You're just going to have to stay tuned to see what that is. But I did need the extra room, and so here I am just kind of making use of whatever's available if there's, nothing else more relevant for me to be showing. But I'm not going to delay any further. Let's get into the first question. We have a fair number to get through today. The Nintendo Music app launched with Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade on it. Since its launch, the app has thus far been updated 7 times as of the 10th of December, with 1 new game soundtrack per week. But predictably, no other FE original soundtrack has been added yet. In what time frame and in what order do you suppose other FEs might join FE7? Bit of an interesting story about this. While I've never used the NSO's music app yet myself, I don't really have much use for it. I was visiting with a friend a few weeks ago, so early December, and they had a playlist from it playing in the background, and I did notice that there were, I think, 2 FE7 tracks in there. Nothing deep cut. It was like the recruitment theme and the player phase battle theme, like Super Smash Bros. Tier level of recognition. So that reminded me of this particular question when I read it. I think they're going to be fairly stingy about it with regard to adding new Fire Emblems. Like, I could see them adding 3 houses and Engage maybe over the next year because they're recognizable Switch titles. But as for the older games, probably not until we get them on the International NSO or whatever it's going to be called for the Switch's successor. And I probably would not anticipate getting anything groundbreaking with that. Like, we'll probably get Sacred Stones. Maybe if they add the GameCube at some point to the NSO, we'll get Path of Radiance. But except for that, and unless we get remakes of the older games, I don't see Nintendo ever letting up on this weird treatment they have of Fire Emblem, where they are definitely pushing it as like a legacy property with both regard to Engage and in Heroes, but they do not want you to have the older games easily accessible, except via, the thing that they don't like that you do. But that's basically the only way to experience most of these games at this point, and that includes their music. So I am aware that Japan's NSO has a bigger selection of classic Fire Emblems, so I'm curious to know what, if any, like if they have access to more on their music app to match that, or if it's the same thing. But either way, yeah, I'm not. Maybe 3 houses in Engage next year, and maybe Sacred Stones if it comes to the NSO. I don't see anything else much in the way coming in 2025. And the general problem with being a Nintendo content creator going into 2025 is that we know almost nothing about what's coming up. Like, yes, we're getting another console, but we know very little about it. We don't know when it's coming. And so it makes this next year difficult to discuss in any concrete way. But on that note, I have a question about that. Biggest hope for Fire Emblem in 2025. As I was just saying, I'm basically hoping that there is something in 2025 aside from, of course, more Heroes content. That could be anything. It could be a spin-off. I highly doubt it would be another new mainline game, although they did drop Engage like 4 months before it came out, so who knows. I'm mostly expecting that if we do get something Fire Emblem related in 2025, it'll be a remake that they'll just sort of send out to die as the Switch is winding down, kind of like what they did with Echoes with the 3DS. But since the next console is supposed to be backwards compatible, it should hopefully not be quite as much of a travesty. Of course, I'm hoping mostly for FE4. Genealogy is my number 1 pick for a remake for multiple reasons. But I would not be disappointed if we got Binding Blade instead. That's another popular choice. I'm not really seeing the Tellius games getting remakes anytime soon. I know a lot of people want them, but I think it's more likely they will be added to NSO or the equivalent program at some point in the next 5-ish years or something. Then we'll get full remakes of them just yet. I would even take the joke that I made a couple of videos ago about us getting Three Houses HD remastered now with more pointless stuff to argue about and absolutely nothing else. Because while I am completely exhausted by the Fodlan games, they do give me the numbers that I want for the algorithm, which is really cynical, but, you know, that's kind of part of being a content creator, is that I have to go where the numbers are, and unfortunately in the world of Fire Emblem, that's mostly Fodlan. Like, I obviously don't hate the Fodlan games, I'm just worn out by them, by the fandom, and I really don't have much else to say on them. There's a few little topics that I can pick over the next year that I probably will dig into, just because, again, there's not a lot coming up for Nintendo fans for me to talk about, but on that note, I will say that the projects that I have for both of the next 2 months, neither of them are Fire Emblem, so you're not going to be seeing any Fire Emblem stuff from me until at least March. And that is partially because of the content drought, but it's also because I just want to explore different things, and there's a good opportunity for those coming up, and hopefully people will tune into that. One of them at least was requested, and the other one is just kind of more of a passion project. I alluded to it at the very beginning of this video, but it's something I'm going to have a lot of fun with, and if it's mostly just for me, it's mostly a vanity project, then so be it. That's about all I can say on the subject of Fire Emblem in 2025. I mean, there'll always be new Heroes content, but for some reason Heroes doesn't really move the needle for me either. I'm not really sure what's up with that. But regardless, next I want to talk about something that's not a question, really, but rather something that was brought to my attention by a patron, a pair of games that he in fact designed himself, and that are up on Steam, and that I hadn't heard of before, but I really wanted to check out as soon as I heard about them. There are quite a few Fire Emblem-inspired indie titles out there. It could practically be a subgenre unto itself, and I played several of them, but these two in particular, they're called Walk with the Living and Walk with the Living 2. They piqued my interest right away because, as the designer described them, they're intended for people who like this particular genre, but are also really into the homosocial and homoerotic subtext that we see a lot in Fire Emblem, but that very rarely gets explored, and when it does, it's typically not very satisfying. So, Walk with the Living and its sequel turn that on its head by having a cast full of that, where it's not just subtext, it's queer content elevated to the level of text, while still situated in this Fire Emblem-esque setting and world. The actual gameplay is obviously based around Fire Emblem, you know, the tactical grid combat and all that, and a lot of the things are the same, like, you know, different unit types, there's a weapon triangle and all that. But the actual crux of what makes them interesting is they take more cues from visual novels than Fire Emblem ever does, in terms of making decisions in dialogue sequences that will impact what characters do down the line, and in rare instances maybe even affect what happens in the chapters. I do believe these games take a bit more risks with that than you ever really see in Fire Emblem. Like, I've had instances where characters would go up to recruit a unit and then they end up both leaving, and while that's pretty disheartening from a gameplay perspective, I like that the story works in a way that that is plausible and is an outcome that you might have to come to expect. And as I mentioned, just so many of these character interactions are queer, and in a variety of ways too, like gay male subtext, there's plenty of sapphic content, there's at least one trans character that I found in the second game, there's a throuple in the second game as well, which I thought was really interesting, because even dating sims that I've run across struggle to depict polyamorous relationships, and yet here's one that actually does it in this FE-inspired context where it comes with a trio ending, if you get that, and I just thought that was interestingly handled for, you know, a topic like that. And it's not just, you know, you have characters of the same sex who are having romantic dialogue with each other, it's that they are occasionally bringing up things like homophobia and needing to hide aspects of themselves in that, and then the sort of liberation that comes from finding somebody who understands that, or, you know, making social progress in some cases. I believe that comes up a little bit more in the back half of the first game. I will also give these games credit too, that they both have really solid initial hooks that draw you in. Like the first game, one of the main characters, and he's on the front art. I don't describe it box art, but like the Steam equivalent of box art. He's a reanimated skeleton, and that just really catches your eye right away. And he's also a gay skeleton, by the way, who has multiple paired endings, including with his ex, who remembers him from before he was a skeleton. But he also has other options for his various endings and so forth. And it's all played very seriously. Like you would expect, walking skeleton who can get gay would be, there'd be a bunch of jokes with, but it's not. There's not a ton of humor in these games. It tends to play things very seriously and dramatically. And then the second game doesn't have quite the same level of visual hook right at the start, but it does open with one of the main characters essentially becoming a werewolf, and then she has to decide whether to embrace that or reject it. But either way, you can play her as either like an archer support human character or as the wolf, which is more of a melee focused unit. There are some interesting outcomes depending on where you want to take that direction of the story and other things that happen in there. So both of them really have a good way of grabbing you in and making you want to play through the whole stories, and neither of them are very long. I think even if you're engaging with the story, you can clear each game separately about in an hour and a half to 2 hours. But there's plenty of replay value in choosing different character combinations and maybe recruiting different people, or just wanting to see some of these wilder outcomes that you can get. And there's also a limited New Game Plus feature in both games, and you can sort of tactically build your units a little differently each time. There's not a lot of unit customization, but there's enough there to where I was interested, enough so too that I wanted to continue to the next chapter. I played through each of these games, I want to say at least 3 times, both for gathering footage and just for experiencing them and seeing what they had to offer. But yes, I want to offer a big thank you to the patron who brought this to my attention and who designed these games. So, this is really well done. I have no knowledge of game design, so I applaud you for that, and I thank you for your support, and hopefully this worked as a good plug for your games. If you have any interest at all in any of the stuff I've just said about Walk with the Living and its sequel, go check these out on Steam. The first game is actually free, so you can try it out, no cost to you. And then if you liked it, go ahead and check out the second one. I mean, I had a really great time with both of these games. I'll leave links to these games' Steam pages down in the description. Pivoting from that back to the subject of unit customization, I have this question. Have you ever given any opinion on reclassing in any of your videos? Not in so many words. Generally speaking, I'm not a fan of reclassing, although that is hard to make a blanket statement about because every Fire Emblem that has it does it a little differently. There's never been one single system they've stuck with, so it's hard to criticize it as a whole. I will say, though, that for games that have 40 plus playable characters and that have over a dozen entries in a series where they don't really reuse characters much, of course you're going to be writing by archetypes a lot and writing by, unit and class types, and so having characters who can just shift in and out of whatever their base class is can frequently be awkward and cause units to lose some of their identity, which is the major reason that I don't really like reclassing. And when I'm playing, I tend to prefer keeping characters in their base classes as much as possible, and since I almost exclusively play on normal mode, that's usually not a problem. 3 houses is the one exception, but that's solely because class mastery exists, which gives my 100% completionist brain something to work towards. So I have the idea to max out everybody in every class, because that's just what I do in games. But aside from that, it is very much a mechanic that I could do without, and that I'm not really ever going to feel the lack of anywhere, like as I was just talking about with Walk with the Living. There's only limited unit customization in there. There's certainly no reclassing or even promotions, but you don't really feel that absence because each unit feels unique and tailored to whatever their particular class is. And that's not always the case, even in older Fire Emblems. You can get units of the same class that feel pretty samey. I'm especially thinking about how many Cavaliers do you get in the Arcanine games? Something like 7 or even more than that. And most of them, you can barely distinguish them. So I get that, but at the same time, especially the free-for-all takes on reclassing, like the DS remakes or 3 Houses, if it hadn't had the class mastery, those get on my nerves. The one, ironically, that I think does reclassing the best, or the one that annoys me the least, is Awakening. And I say ironically because I rarely have anything positive to say about Awakening, but this may be one of the rare instances where I do. I like that it restricts how characters can reclass into these distinct sets that you can't expand upon. Like, Fates did something similar, but Fates also allows you to sort of break out of those bonds through support conversations. Awakening only lets you customize units' class sets through breeding, which I'm fine with because it feels like an extension of Genealogy's take on eugenics babies. That doesn't bother me very much, and I just kind of like how each character's sets of classes are more tailored for them, and in most cases, so that it still feels like an extension of how they've been developed as a character, and you're not having like these weird cases that you see in support conversations where, like, for example, Pegasus Knights will frequently reference the fact that they have a Pegasus, but then that gets awkward when, you know, they're in a class that isn't mounted anymore, so where does the Pegasus go? Or even something more basic like Sacred Stones, where you have... I know Vanessa talks about her Pegasus in her support conversations, but what if you promoted her to Wyvern Knight? Her Pegasus changed species. So how do you handle that? And in most cases, the writing just doesn't handle that. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of reclassing, and why I think unit customization can go in other directions that work a bit better with the restrictions that Fire Emblem has. I do appreciate that Engage has something like 13 unique classes and class lines between Alir, the Royals, Vale, the DLC units, and all that. And while not all of those unique classes are great gameplay-wise, they do distinguish the lead characters a lot more than if they were in generic classes. So I thought that was a decent compromise, for at least for the major characters, to have all those unique classes. I realized that we're basically stuck with reclassing, except maybe in some remakes, because like Avatars, it's a thing that most people like, and I'm just weird and I don't. But you wanted my opinion on reclassing, so there it is. Do you think Fire Emblem settings will ever move the clock forward? Or are they comfortable enough with their setting to never bother experimenting, dubstep missiles notwithstanding? I'm glad you brought up the Agarthans, because they encapsulate pretty well what I think Fire Emblem is pretty much always going to stick to in terms of futuristic content, or even moving the clock forward beyond vague Renaissance references, essentially. The biggest exception I can think of is actually Book 5 of Heroes, which has a very steampunk vibe to it, with robot horses and guns that somehow qualify as tomes and all that. But they still try to situate that within the understanding of the other characters, which is still like pseudo-medieval, early modern. And then the next book comes along and they go do something completely different, because that's just what Heroes does. It never sticks to one aesthetic. And so those are really the only exceptions we've seen so far of a Fire Emblem going somewhere different in terms of technology. And I'm not expecting that to ever really change, because the setting is so grounded in that familiar, you know, the fake medieval thing, which is especially kind of funny when you look at FE1 and see that it was supposed to be more like Greco-Roman inspired, and yet they moved away from that pretty quickly, and then they sort of changed the vibes of Arcanea as the series went on, most famously giving Marth pants instead of a tunic. Imagine if they'd stuck with that, though, like the sword and sandals feel more than the medieval one. Unfortunately, I think Fire Emblem is a little too grounded in what it has going on already to really step out of that. They do occasionally go elsewhere in terms of cultural references, like Fates being the biggest example, because it has an entire major country based on Japan as opposed to the European references that we usually get. Aside from that, and those are all tend to be one-offs, I don't see it being like a consistent thing that ever moves forward. Like, we're never going to get Fire Emblem with guns. Knowing the context of where this particular ask comes from, I think this may also have to do with my interest in the settings in terms of like my fan fiction writing, which I suppose I have to mention a little bit, because I do talk about how the one fandom that I have written fic for is a more early modern 19th century setting, which is easier for me to work with and get interested in, because that just happens to be my particular literary area. and because, I like large urbanized cities, which is something that I'm going to bring up later for a different question. But anyway, yeah, going back to Fire Emblem, I'm not really seeing it, and I don't think it worked all that well in Three Houses, honestly, because the Agarthans are so much style over substance. Maybe if they'd been written better, but they're not. Yeah, I'm not holding my breath on us ever getting, like, an even 18th or 19th century inspired Fire Emblem. Shifting gears here, what are your expectations for Pokemon Legends ZA? And what are your hopes and fears for it, unrealistic ones included? I have very little hype for Legends ZA, even though it is taking place in my favorite Pokemon setting, Kalos, and it's based apparently entirely in Lumio City, which remains my favorite city in that franchise, despite the obvious technical limitations. The trailer came out something like 10 months ago now, and we've had nothing since, so it's really hard for me to sustain the hype in a situation like that, particularly because I never really played through the original Pokemon Legends. I got about an hour in before I realized it just wasn't clicking with me, and part of that is the open world format. I've never been a big fan of open worlds, but also just the gameplay wasn't really grabbing my attention, and so I'm hoping that the second Legends game does something to address that. I do already prefer that it's going to be an urban environment, which I generally find more interesting if I am going to play open worlds. And I'm hoping that they'll maybe tone down some of the more tedious elements of the, I forget what you call them, like the tasks that you have to do in the Pokedex, rather than just catching things, you have to do all these other things like using certain moves and catching a whole bunch of each species. One thing that the original Legends had that I liked and that I hope makes a return is that it's, I believe, the first mainline Pokemon game ever to allow you to catch everything in the Dex in one game without having to trade or do anything like that. Which, as a completionist, of course I love, and I do not mind in the slightest the reverse of that will end up with a smaller Pokedex overall, because having 200 or so of them is just fine with me. Like, I don't need the full set of 1,000 plus that we currently have, and I'm certainly not expecting that. I would like to see more regional forms, which is a realistic expectation, I think, because pretty much every game since they started coming out in Gen 7 has had regional forms, and I like the idea. I think it's an interesting way to sort of revitalize older Pokemon, give them a fresh coat of paint and all that. As far as legendaries go, I would like to see the return of the Swords of Justice. I believe that's what they're called, because they're based on the Trois Mousquetaires, even though they were introduced in Unova and not Kalos, which is weird, but this is a chance for Game Freak and the Pokemon Company to sort of rectify that, in addition to the whole, like, fleshing out Kalos more than what it got in X and Y, because I know there were development issues behind that one that were the reason that we never got a third game. I think my main fear with this game is that it gets pushed back to the Switch successor, which we still know almost nothing about, as I mentioned earlier, which is just making 2025 really hard to predict in terms of gaming for me. I would like to still be able to play it on the Switch, but it would not surprise me very much if Legends became a launch title for the Switch 2, or whatever it's going to be called. That's not much, but as I noted earlier, we only have that 1 minute and a half long trailer to go off at this point, so until Nintendo releases something else, there's very little I can say about ZA. Did I just say ZA? I think I did. So that's actually kind of funny and works as a very weak segue into the last question, or rather prompt, that I have, because if you didn't know, the last letter of the alphabet is pronounced Z in French and in most forms of English, but in American English it's pronounced Z, and I think I've said that form earlier when I was talking, maybe when I introduced the question or something like that. That kind of sort of relates to this last prompt that I have, which is going to require quite the long preface, so let's just get into that. Several months ago, this was back over the summer, one of my patrons suggested a video idea for me to talk about Catholicism and Catholic aesthetics in video games that I liked and disliked. And I sat on that idea for some time, about half a year, before I finally decided that I wouldn't be able to turn it into a full video. The main reason for this, and this is the preface that I would have to introduce such a concept to you, is that with as front-loaded as YouTube content is, like you have to grab somebody's attention with your title and your thumbnail and your first 30 seconds or you lost them, I was worried that making a video entirely and overtly about mainstream organized religion, when I'm primarily known as a guy who talks about gay stuff, would strike my longtime subs as a weird pivot and possibly like invite types of subscribers that I'm not necessarily interested in courting because I don't normally talk about major organized religions. It just didn't seem like a good idea that I could pull off within the restrictions of how the algorithm works on this website. Particularly because when you hear people talking about Catholicism on the internet, the loudest voices I've noticed tend to be members of the Tradcath movement, whose whole goal is basically to make Catholicism as much like conservative American Protestantism as possible, which is just gross on so many levels and not the sort of people I want to be associated with. Because, not to get too deep into the weeds here, but I am French, and the French are famously quite secular, and I'm also from New Orleans, which is an infamously decadent city that revels in Catholic aesthetics, but also pairs it with a wanton love of hedonism and a morbidity that American Protestants have long found to be distasteful at best and worthy of being destroyed by hurricanes at worst. I've fielded a fair bit of that in my life. I did live through Hurricane Katrina, by the way, and the media aftermath of that storm, which was quite interesting as a formative experience, I have to say. But anyway, I am coming at Catholicism from a very different perspective from which you might hear on other places of the internet, and so I wanted to make that clear right from the start that I'm not doing a weird conservative pivot here. I am still primarily the gay subtext guy, and because of my upbringing, I do not have any sort of cognitive dissonance with being gay, hedonistic, and at least nominally Catholic. And I enjoy the aesthetics of the religion, which is primarily what you see in these fantastical depictions of Catholicism. It's not so much the religion itself, it's the visual trappings. And by the way, I'm showing off a lot of Three Houses footage right now because it is sort of related to this point, and I will mention it a little later. But it's more because it's just really easy footage for me to access for this topic. It's not entirely about Three Houses here. Now, the patron who suggested this to me also recommended a video by YouTuber Moon Channel on Christian video games that I will link down in the description. I did watch it. I found it rather interesting, especially because I'd never heard of any of the video games that the guy is talking about in the video, and also because his conclusion is essentially that because of the Protestant work ethic, Christian games, or specifically these American Protestant games that he's focusing on, they kind of have to suck by design, which is just a really funny conclusion to draw. That was enlightening for me because that's just a whole world of games that I never heard of and have zero interest in. But what I'm talking about today, and what I'm much more familiar with, is, as mentioned, not express depictions of Christianity or Catholicism itself, but rather games that take the trappings of Catholicism and kind of mold them in ways to look fitting for whatever their fantasy setting is. I guess I'll go ahead and start with Three Houses, while also acknowledging that this is not the only Fire Emblem to have a pseudo-Catholic church. In fact, most of them have one. I generally do not care for the Church of Saros as a pseudo-Catholic religion, and it's less because of anything that's in the game, because there are some points in it that I actually like what they did with it. There's one moment when you're in ALL and the characters will talk about a folk belief that is not a core part of the church's teachings, but it's something that a lot of people in that area hold about that region. And I thought that was a nice touch because that's not something you see in these fantasy depictions of Catholicism often. Catholicism is very much not a monolith. It is extremely culturally diverse. And depending on where you go, the different saints, feast days, miscellaneous rituals like carnival and things like that, they can vary quite a bit. And I liked seeing that. And a lot of what we think of as core Catholic beliefs, something like the fact that the Blessed Mother was conceived without sin, those originated as folk beliefs not officially accepted by the church and were like that for many centuries until they were made canon in the very literal sense. So I liked that kind of nod, that, the sort of religious pluralism under the umbrella of a single church. Other stuff, though, I think the organization of the Church of Saros is more like Eastern Orthodoxy, where there's these regional state churches that all answer to a single head. And, of course, there's the fact that the leader is a woman, which is not a thing in the Catholic Church, although that is fairly common and allows for other things to go on, mostly in terms of, like, waifu gacha stuff, because this is IS we're talking about. They make most of their money off of waifu gacha. That's kind of the extent of what I feel about them in terms of the game. In terms of the fandom, though, that's where it gets messy and where I just have to turn my brain off after a while. I think a lot of people in Three Houses discourse bring their own religious trauma to these arguments, but the problem is that this is, at least from what I've seen, it's all from the Anglophone world, and the Anglophone world is majority Protestant. And I have a lot of trouble trusting stuff like that because Protestantism by its nature has anti-Catholicism baked into it. And so, because of that, and because the Catholic Church is a much larger punching bag than any individual Protestant denomination, these takes where Three Houses is openly critical of the actual Catholic Church, they feel misdirected to me, just because of that issue that I mentioned with anti-Catholicism, but also just because I really don't think the Japanese care very much to make statements like that, and also evil churches are a dime a dozen in JRPGs, so I'm not really reading much into that. And I think even the Moon Channel video mentioned, either that video or maybe another video that he's done, how Japanese approaches to religion and spirituality are more amenable to the whole killing God thing that you see in a lot of JRPGs, as opposed to Western religions, where even when you're dystheistic or oppositional to the religion that you're a part of or you believe in, you're not really framing it in terms of, like, literally killing the deity in question. Moving on from Fire Emblem, I do like both of the Octopath Traveler games for how they deal with their pseudo-Catholic churches and their cleric characters. The first one is more of a sort of low-key pious spiritual take on it. The second game goes in the opposite direction with its clerical character because he's a chronic doubter. Like, his catchphrase is actually "doubt is what I do." He still believes, and he still, holds to the gods in his own fashion, but it's distinctly a quirky, weird sort of way that clashes against the more traditional beliefs of his partner / maybe subtextual boyfriend, because that's another thing, he might be gay. And that produces some interesting friction, and it's generally entertaining and allows me to forgive that storyline for still falling back on the church hierarchy is mostly corrupt and you have to kill them. Stepping outside of Japanese games, it's a little embarrassing to bring this up because I don't want to publicly admit how many years I played World of Warcraft for, but I do like their spin, or spins, plural, on Christian religions in their fantasy worlds, because there's a whole lot of variation in it depending on which culture they have. You can obviously tell they're pulling on Catholic aesthetics, but the religion of the light, which is the main one, seems to be more like Buddhism in that it's more about enlightenment and there's no actual deity. But then you have these creatures called Naru, which are basically like angels. The fandom likes to call them chandeliers because of how they look. And I do think they're an interesting take on the concept of angels as these eldritch beings beyond understanding, that they're like these shining geometric shapes and they just kind of speak in your head. And like I said, too, different cultures in their world take the light in different directions theologically. The Blood Elves, one of my favorite races, tend to be closer to what I am because they're primarily focused with the aesthetics of the light and not so much the morality of it. At one point, they were just flat out exploiting the light to get paladin powers, and that was many years ago in the storyline, but I still found that really funny, and just like, I kind of wish they still had that edge to them. Or you can look at other races like the Draenei, which I've seen their religion and their take on the light compared to Eastern Orthodox Christianity and also Judaism, which is rather fascinating that different people can read different real-world religious references into these fantasy races. Now, WoW is kind of infamous for using a broad brush for a lot of its cultural depictions. This is the game that turns its minotaurs into very obvious Native American stereotypes. So I do take all of this with a grain of salt, but, it's a prominent Western example of Catholicism being used in these fantasy settings in a way that's recognizable, but it's also distant enough to where it's not like actual Catholicism. The Darkest Dungeon games go a lot bleaker with their depictions of religion, which is not surprising given the Lovecraftian elements of the setting. And they do go kind of heavy with the religious characters' trauma, especially the second game has you living that out to get their skill points and stuff. But I think it works for that setting, so I'm not going to really complain about it. And they have brought back the second game, which is the one I'm more interested in. They did bring back over various updates religious characters from the first game that I liked getting to see again, like the Vestal and the Crusader. So I'm happy about that, and I can accept the darkness because everything in those games is dark. Those are the ones that primarily spring to mind out of games that I have played, which of course is not all of them, and I know for a fact that there are other games, both Japanese and Western, that riff on Catholicism in interesting ways. I just haven't experienced all of them because I can be quite picky when it comes to game recommendations and that sort of thing. That's just kind of how I roll. But I did want to try my best to give some examples out of what I'm familiar with that stand out to me for good and for bad. But with that, I believe I am done with all of the questions and prompts that I received this year. I got a fair number of them, and there's a few others here and there that I might turn into videos at some point. I have a lot of ideas for where my channel can go in 2025 because I feel like I'm going to have to step out of the Fire Emblem mold a bit because there's just nothing happening in terms of Fire Emblem in 2025, unfortunately. Thank you all for watching and for listening to all of this and for continuing to support my channel, which has grown quite a bit in the past year, and I'm very happy about that. I surpassed 1,000 this year, and I hope I continue growing in spite of the content drought. I will just have to find some ways to make content myself, and I do have some ideas, so you guys can look forward to that over the upcoming months. But anyway, thank you all again. Thank you especially to my patrons and to everyone else who contributed to this Q&A session, and I will talk to you guys later. Au revoir.